Okay, so we'll get started. Thanks again. I see more and more people are joining, which is great. And thank you all for taking some time out of your Friday. So my name is Michael Mazur. I'm the Vice President of Business Development at Colu, based in New York City. And we're very happy to be hosting this webinar in conjunction with ELGL, and really here to tell you all a little bit more about the American Rescue Plan Act and different things that we see that we would hope you guys all get to learn and get to know much more, especially when it comes to technology and innovation. And what we'll talk a little bit more about is small businesses and local consumption. So that's really the topic of this webinar. We'll run through kind of from a high level, then going a little bit more into the detail. And then, which is my favorite part, we'll open it up to questions and open up a dialogue, which I think can be very fruitful. Because a lot of times what we see is just getting people, government officials from the West Coast to connected with government officials from the East Coast and Midwest, and learning different things and hopefully being able to take action. So thanks again. And let's just get started.
And Michael, let me just add, please feel free to add any kind of questions at the Q&A tab. I'll co-pilot this webinar together with Michael, and I'll be happy to answer during the webinar. Of course, we're taking a recording of this webinar, and we'll be also happy to share with you all the slide deck. So without further ado, Michael.
Thank you. And Elad, by the way, is our Global Business Development Manager at Colu. So thank you, Elad, for joining. And so what I will say is kind of just to start, the hardest thing to do in government is to deal with one-time money and not waste it. That's from Mayor Funkhauser of Kansas City. And, I think we have seen this in action. I can say that we have been working with local governments now, and in the past year have met with over 200 local governments and really worked on different strategies. And we really saw that, especially with the CARES Act, there was this huge challenge to figure out what to do very quickly and how to make sure that it has impact. So we really want to take this sort of sentence into account and see what we can do proactively instead of reactively to help support cities and local governments during these times. So a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. So we'll talk about the American Rescue Plan, which was approved about a week and a half ago, almost 2 weeks ago. In numbers, how is it different than the CARES Act? We'll talk a little bit more about how the ARP Act, as we call it, can help small businesses. What are short-term things that cities can do, and what are long-term things that cities can do? And we'll see why, because of the deadline, which is much later, which is get the anticipation up for those who don't know. We'll talk about grants and loyalty, meaning how we can use kind of elements of gamification and behavioral economics to really utilize funds in a way to, again, create this long-term change to get people to think about local, shopping local and all that. We'll then just talk quickly about, the concept of how do we use these funds to implement technological solutions? What are other cities that have done it? And what are we seeing sort of the conversation going towards from the cities that we've been speaking to now in regards to the ARP Act? And then we'll talk a little bit more about how, it's interesting to see the on one hand, common denominators between cities, but then also the differences. But it's funny to see that there are common denominators with cities, whether it's a larger city like Boston, a mid-sized city like Akron or Rancho Cordova, and understanding, again, best practices of how they work together and how they can kind of learn from each other. So that's really the agenda here. And like Elad mentioned, please feel free to ask questions as we go. Obviously, we understand that everyone has different opinions and thoughts, and we really want to learn also from you all, and hopefully you guys can learn from each other. So just kind of quickly about the American Rescue Plan. So double the support. So this time, unlike the CARES Act, local governments will be receiving $360 billion, as opposed to half that amount during the CARES Act. This is significantly more, and this money is going directly to the cities. So the cities are getting direct funding, which ultimately means that each municipality will get their own kind of allotment, and we're happy to help for y'all to, if you want to see about exactly how much y'all are going to be receiving. But cities will get it directly. So they'll have a lot more autonomy to decide also how to use those funds. And I know from the CARES Act that that was a huge issue initially. It was that there had to be a lot of layers, especially for smaller municipalities, under 500,000 residents, how to really get the funds passed through, how to get, proactive initiatives. There were many layers, and that kind of prevented a lot of proactive initiatives to go on with the CARES Act. So we see that this is a very big thing. Now, timing we see is huge because I can't even tell you how much we heard about with the CARES Act, the December 31, 2020 deadline, which obviously last second was extended. But I think what makes the ARP Act so great in relative terms is that here we have till the end of 2024. And cities will have a lot more time to use these funds and a lot more time to think strategically how to use these dollars in a way that is not just a band-aid, but really helps kind of start this recovery and look forward ahead to the post-COVID world and looking at how is our world going to be different than it was back in 2019, and what are things that we can learn from this past year that hopefully can help create this better local ecosystem, create civic pride, create and local consumption and things like that. So how is it different? Like I was kind of mentioning a little bit more into the details. So the ARP really allows cities to receive direct funding from the federal government. And ultimately, the ARP will support and does support long-term policies to revitalize local businesses. And we'll talk a little bit more, which I'm sure some of y'all are familiar with how small businesses have been affected here. But the main kind of point is that these funds from the ARP Act really are here to kind of look at how we can not only help local businesses, but how we can also create this methodology of equity within cities. And we can talk a little bit, about projects like ours in Boston, where a lot of the efforts that we're taking are not just on how do we support small businesses in general, which obviously is critical, but how do we support minority-owned businesses? How do we support businesses that their owners don't speak great English? How do we support businesses that may not be tech savvy and implement technological solutions? So these funds, I think, are not just only for this kind of immediate solution, but also looking at ways to see, hey, post-pandemic, cities and our lives are much more tech oriented, and they likely will be. So how do we leverage that and really start something that can be much more long term? And so what are the purposes? And again, this is just going to giving you all a sort of summary of these things. So the main purposes of the rescue plan: we want to offset the negative impacts of COVID-19, assistance to households, small businesses, and nonprofits. And again, this conversation here will be more, this discussion will be more on small businesses specifically. Another thing is aid to impacted industries and tourism, travel, and hospitality. That also will relate a little bit to what we'll be talking about, because again, tourism is a huge part of also small business consumption in many cities and local government. So of course, they're interchangeable. Infrastructure, of course, and then also for getting premium pay for eligible workers that are essential workers and for their work during the pandemic. So here's kind of a graph that outlines the existing situation and how we think cities can look at it also a little bit differently. So up until now, federal funds went to residents in the form of economic impact payments or unemployment insurance. And then the other side, they went to small businesses, usually through cities or counties, and they went to in the form of grants or loans. Now, grants or loans are great, and I'm sure y'all or most of y'all have had some experience with them. But what we have seen again and again from cities all over of all different sizes is that these grants and these loans are great as a one-time band-aid, but cities were not really able to see what impact these grants and loans had on their small businesses. We would ask cities and counties, what data do you have? What information do you have of how these loans and grants have helped? And a lot of times they said, we just don't know. So what we're trying to help cities think about is looking specifically at how we can help reappropriate a portion of funds, for example, to incentivize different behaviors to get people to be much more in the habit of shopping local, for example. So how do you use some of these funds as incentives to really maximize the economic impact of the funds in a way that will create a long-term behavioral change that will last far longer than these funds on their own? And we see that one of the short-term effects of the pandemic is this whole surge towards e-commerce giants like Amazon, towards big box retailers. And it's creating this sort of short-term threat, again, because of the pandemic, to small businesses, but it's also creating an existential threat. And we see this based on the data. As we go on, we see that the dichotomy is growing, right? Amazon is doing great, which is great for them. But on the flip side, small businesses are suffering like never before. So how do we kind of not say to people, don't buy on Amazon at all, but how do we take a portion of consumption made on Amazon and get people into the habit of also knowing and being aware, right, that they have alternatives at local businesses? And so what we want to help kind of give you guys a thought process of is looking at these types of models of using these funds to not just kind of create this sort of one-time support, but really looking at ways to create a behavioral change that will also shift consumption habits far longer than these one-time grants or loans, and far longer than the ARP Act, right? Which is, again, a one-time boost. So how do we take this boost and make it kind of last for decades? So here's just an example that we like to show. So in 2020, the average US resident spent over $1,300 annually on e-commerce platforms. Now, this number is obviously growing more and more. So if we look at a mid-sized city that has around 280,000 residents, that means that in the city, people spent close to $367 million annually in e-commerce platform. What if we take 5%, just 5% of those shopping or that consumption made at e-commerce platform and shift them to small businesses and local businesses? What impact will that make? So in a city of this size, it would really increase the local annual revenue of local businesses by over 18 million. So the point is not looking at shifting it from A to B, meaning a binary way. It's taking a portion, right? It's reshifting the pie just a little and seeing what impact that has. Now, another statistic we love is that 45% of every dollar spent at a local business stays local, as opposed to about 20% of dollars spent at big box retailers or at chains. So if you look at the secondary spending of this, that's another $8.3 million. So obviously the effects are there. Some cities take direct sales tax, so of course that's even more substantial. But these are obviously things that we see, again, a small change can make a huge long-term impact that's far beyond the incentives on their own. So one other statistic that we love to show, and again, I'll explain a little bit about how this connects with the ARP Act, is that 76% of Amazon Prime members are not only willing to pay more to shop at local businesses, but they're also willing to go out of their way. And we see this as an interesting statistic because it kind of contradicts, right, the data that we saw where, Amazon's going up and their market cap is growing and small business cap is decreasing. But what we see the void here being is really that a lot of time it has to be with awareness, meaning the vehicle. What are the vehicles that people have or residents have to be able to know that they have a local alternative? Because we are all creatures of habits, right? So that's why we always say, these one-time grants or loans, from what we hear from cities, are great, but they don't get people to shop at these local businesses, right? So that's kind of where this interesting diversion comes from. So here is what we always are trying to do, is how do we take these numbers and how do we make them or turn them into a reality? So
and Michael, just a second before, I know that you're now just about to speak about how to implement the technology, but you mentioned something which is a great segue to a question that came from Tim, who asked, and this is something we actually hear from many cities, is that cities now have more balance. It's true, Tim. Cities do have more balance to make decision how to use this funding. So if you look at the $65 billion that go directly to cities, it's true that right now you can make a decision if you want to focus on something like broadband or to implement another kind of technology. And I think that Michael mentioned it before, that really this time cities are really at the forefront of making the decision. So cities has more judgment about it, less restricted, and the whole process of also justifying the objective that the money will be used for is really different this time. So I see your question, and let me know if that answers. But not all the money comes with like kind of a colored budget. No one really going to tell you if to implement a platform to support small businesses or to run a infrastructure program.
And that's a great point, Alad, because I think we see also from the data that a lot of times it's a challenge, right? How do you allocate these budgets, right? When you have so many kind of conflicting interests and so many things that need to be done. So that's why we're such big proponents of talking about, maximizing the economic impact of funds. So really kind of looking at it from a different level of like, what's the economic multiplier of funds and how do we really use the least amount to make the most impact? So that's sort of the thought process. And we've seen from a lot of different cities that with the CARES Act, we're able to implement different technological models kind of with those funds. So here's some example. I'll just, St. Petersburg, Carteret County, North Carolina, I know about what they did. And if y'all have more questions, we're happy to answer about these specific cities and what they've done. And of course, we're constantly, our data team is constantly monitoring in policies, looking at seeing what our new cities doing and kind of constantly in the loop about how our cities thinking about using these funds. We learn a lot from the council meetings and we learn a lot from doing a lot of analysis on those. Akron, Ohio is a city that we have worked with. And that's a city that we know has launched the Akronite app, which is, again, an app that rewards residents for shopping local. And it's something that now is being launched in new cities all over. So a little bit more kind of, before I even get to these other examples, just kind of from a higher level of the CARES Act and of the, ARP Act, and kind of to segue towards some of the questions asked. So just some more data about the sort of thinking of the ARP Act and why it kind of all connects. So I think that, what we have been seeing that we want to talk about is the distress coming up to specific businesses that are either minority-owned businesses, that are businesses that are in specific underserved neighborhoods, and making sure that the ARP Act can be equitable. So a lot of times, from the data and from the information that we have seen, is that cities really want to make sure, right, that that is something that is a focus. So we get asked that all the time in the sense of saying, hey, what this is great, technology is wonderful, but not everyone can use technology. Not everyone may have a cell phone. Not all business owners may have the capacity to do it. So I would say that a big thing for cities to think about is that a lot of times technology on its own isn't enough. And it's about looking at how we can take the technology and implement it real time in cities with a boots on the ground approach. So I would say that a lot of the work that we're doing right now with cities is looking at the technology as one hand of the one step, but the subsequent step, which is even greater in my opinion, is saying how do we really implement it? Meaning, how do you get businesses to partake in different initiatives, right? I know a lot of cities with loans or grants had a lot of money, but didn't even get to use them all because businesses had such a hard time applying for these grants, applying for these loans, or understanding how to use them. So we're very much kind of proponents of technology is great and talk, let's talk the talk, but let's also walk the walk in the sense of let's make sure that we can really, really create equity with these funds in a way that will promote different initiatives. And using, again, the concepts of behavioral economics, really trying to tie in new ways of thinking to, again, change behavior so that people think local and think local for the long run. So that's just one other point that I wanted to mention. Elad, I don't know if you had that other point that you wanted to talk about quickly.
Actually, I do want to refer to the question came from Christopher, who asked if we've heard any type, what would be the type of reporting that will be required for the fund. So again, this is all information we're aggregating from a lot of calls with cities, webinar, state level agencies. But it seems from what we're learning right now that because of the fact that this dollar is going to be distributed over the long term, so until the end of 2024, this time cities would be required to have a much more robust and detailed reporting of not only where the money was assigned or allocated, but also what was the economic impact of the dollars. And again, if you go back and read the language of this wonderful 600 pages piece of legislation, you learn that really the purposes and the vision of the lawmakers was not only to go behind of the COVID right now, the pandemic, but also really to think of more long-term purposes, like bringing communities together, support the hardest hit communities that were hit by the pandemic. So I think that this is what they really want to see here. So more of a robust report. So, and Michael, I know that like I'm getting also here messages that people want to hear a bit more of a high level information about the CARES Act. So, for example, cities with less than 50,000 residents, how much they're expected, to receive, and also when is the first wave of dollars is about to land in cities.
Yeah, sure. And then I see some more questions, so we'll get to that in a second. But to your point, so obviously the first thing is that it's double the support. So the CARES Act provided 150 billion to state and local governments, whereas the ARP Act provides 360 billion, of which those 360 billion, 65.1 billion is dedicated solely for non-county municipalities. So a big chunk is going directly to the municipalities. And one other point is that out of the 360 billion that state governments receive, 130.2 billion are from what they call the coronavirus local fiscal recovery fund. So out of those funds, over 45, so I think close to 46 billion will go to non-county municipalities with a population equal to or above 50,000 residents. And those with the population under 50,000, that fund will be of about 19.53 billion. So each city really will get their aid calculated based on a formula. From what we understand, that formula is based off the population, growth, poverty level, housing, overcrowding. And we're happy to, again, like we're mentioning, share more city by city breakdown if you all have some more interest. And the distribution of these funds will be made in two waves of equal amounts. The first one, again, no later than 30 days after the enactment, so coming up. And the second wave, no earlier than 12 months after the first. So I would say that a lot of, again, these discussions and these thoughts are really to take this thought process of being proactive instead of reactive, and really trying to plan strategically moving forward so that, again, we can be smart about using these funds and really look ahead and strategically plan it and use technology. So that's kind of the thought process. And again, it's coming up. So we know that this is starting to come up in city councils and discussions and conversations. And we really just want to be able to support and help and really take what we learned from so many cities and be able to, again, share that knowledge with you all, because we know that cities always are interested in learning from others. And I think that's also something that is awesome that ELGL is doing, but really being able to connect the dots and have lessons learned, because we are going through an unprecedented time. And I hope and really believe that this recovery will stem from these types of proactive initiatives. So,
And
yeah,
Michael, one more question, maybe before you cover, just like in 2 minute things that we're currently doing in Boston, we've done in Akron in the past few months. So Tina asked about the funds that are going to the CDBG, and if cities would have to follow the guidelines of CDBG, as we know they're more restricted. So Tina, based on what we hear, the restrictions are gonna stay. So the guidelines are the guidelines as it refers to CDBG. But what I can tell you is that we see many cities found very creative ways to use the CDBG. And the one example that really resonated with me is a city called San Marcos in Texas, where they use this CDBG funds and allocated them to small businesses, even not necessarily minority-owned or hard-to-see businesses, to purchase or to pay for digital services. So, for example, to serve purpose of digital transformation, starting an online platform for businesses, designing a website, or starting a ad account on Google or another social media account. So these actions were made with CDBG, so there might be a way to do so. Michael, you're muted.
Whoops, sorry about that. So let me just move forward and talk a little bit more about just what we're doing and quickly some lessons learned, and then we'll get into more questions because I see they are starting to come in. So I will just say that one thing we're noticing is really the sense of, we see that a lot of cities are seeing an influx of people that are working from home. So a lot of suburbs surrounding the main larger city, Akron being an example. And we see this again all over, West Coast to East Coast to Midwest, and also down in Texas, we see that happening a lot. And cities now have a lot more sort of people that come in and have a lot more purchase power, that they used to probably leave for work at 7, 8 a.m. and come back home at 6, 7 p.m. and really 5 days a week. So the time spent in their suburb was much less than it is today. And even post-pandemic, from the research and information we're seeing, people will still be working from home, whether it's 10% to 60, 70% of the time. So 1 day a week from home, maybe 3 days a week from home, but people will be working from home. And this is really starting this new desire of cities, and especially, again, those surrounding the larger cities, to create a sense of civic pride, so that people know what they have if they want to go out for lunch, if they want to go out on a break, if they're, again, are missing some of those social interactions that they had at their office. So a lot of what we're working with cities on is, how do we really reposition the thinking to this sort of sense of a hybrid model post-pandemic? And how do we, again, establish this sense of local civic pride, and really giving people more awareness of what they have at their footsteps that they may have not even thought about before. And a lot of what we're doing is really looking at things more from the gamification or behavioral economics perspective. So we're looking at working with cities and creating a unique city coin for them, which really rewards positive behavior. So we're working with cities like in the city of Boston, where we're launching in the upcoming weeks. And in the city of Boston, really, people, whenever they shop at local businesses in Boston, they will get rewarded with Boston points. And that's sort of the economic driver. The point is, how do you gamify local consumption? How do you gamify behaviors so that people constantly and subconsciously think about shopping local and doing these things, right? So we always use this analogy of like airline points, right? You're constantly progressing towards getting, a status, or constantly progressing and looking at how many points you received, or credit card points. So how do we get people to kind of have the same subconscious thought process? So if they're debating, am I going to shop at a Starbucks or at a local cafe? am I gonna shop at on Amazon or at a local mini market? When you make that subconscious decision, what tools do you have? What emotional connection do you have to the local businesses to prompt you to think local? And so that's a lot of the elements that we're working on. We're working on helping cities get data from these efforts to really make sure that, number one, they can tell their constituents and show, what impact their dollars, taxpayer dollars, are making. And number two, also to learn and to improve quickly, and to really make sure that, let's say, the first round of funds is used in a way, in some way, and then the second round we can learn from the data and again, improve that economic multiplier, improve the economic impact. And that 9x economic multiplier is what we're seeing, again, be huge. So how does rewarding people for shopping local really increase that multiplier? So if someone, let's say, spends $10 at a local business and they're getting 20% back in the form of a local coin, so how does that really create an economic multiplier that will keep getting people to shop local and really will ultimately create a longer term behavioral change? And moving forward, again, this is sort of from our data in Akron, Ohio, which was our first city where we launched back in August. So mid of the pandemic, or height of the pandemic. And we really see that in Akron, people get blimps for shopping local. Akron is a mid-sized city with about 200,000 residents, very sort of unique, but also a city that wanted to focus on their small businesses because they had a whole Main Street construction, and also a lot of their minority owned businesses, specifically Black owned businesses, were really suffering during the pandemic, and they wanted to take action. So people, for example, that shop on Main Street right now in Akron literally can get almost up to 40% back in local coins, so in Akron blimps, for shopping at these local businesses. And those blimps that people get, they can only use at local businesses in Akron. City of Boston, like I was mentioning, is launching Be Local, and we're learning a lot again about equity here, about approaching business owners that don't speak great English, approaching individuals and business owners who are not tech savvy, and also from a customer perspective, from a user perspective, how to make sure that this is accessible so that different people can learn and earn or get rewarded for shopping local. So,
And
sorry,
Michael, just
go ahead.
yeah, just before we'll take questions live, but at the same time, I do want to place and emphasize on one more point, because as I said before, now cities are trying to look over the future and decide how, and strategize how to use these dollars to really promote the most strategic goals of their cities and how to promote their policies. So I truly think that even if cities, if yourself, you want to implement technology, I think that we can all learn a lot of lessons from this pandemic. We learn the power of a story, especially when it comes from the public sector and the local government. People are seeking for authenticity. They want to know who are the people behind the initiative. So I think that like really approaching this and using this awareness campaign and this elimination of gamification would really serve your goal. So I would heavily consider it. Now moving forward, thinking also, how do I communicate this initiative to residents? So
perfect. And so that's kind of it. So I'll start answering some questions, and feel free again to either raise your hand or put them in the Q&A chat. I see Graham Richard S. So first, let me just answer this question from the Q&A and then get to you, Graham. So someone just asked, we are a township of about 22,000. We have several areas that we have been looking at for economic development, even prior to COVID-19. We are set to receive about $2.2 million. Do you have any suggestions or examples at how we might be able to use these funds within the guidelines to spur this development to revitalize our township? Or would we need to more focus on existing businesses? Are there specific areas in the legislation documents that would be good for us to focus on a place, or for a place like us? So Elad, also feel free to chime in, but I would think that, obviously a portion of the funds, right, would need to focus on likely existing businesses that are there to help, again, boost that. and to get people to shop at those businesses. What we see usually happen is that there's this sort of longer term impact, meaning as people are more in the habit of shopping local at local businesses, then more businesses come back. So it's like the secondary impact. Um, in terms of the specific legislation and different aspects of the ARP Act, we're happy to share some of that. You can just send me an email. I'm happy to share with you some of the some of the guidelines that our policy team have found that you can use. And we're happy to also help get creative. But ultimately, it's looking at, again, supporting the immediate, the immediate businesses that need the immediate support, and then seeing how that kind of can help trickle additional businesses to come in and really showcasing it. So a lot of that is the awareness. And Graham, here, let me allow it to talk. I don't know, Graham, if you can hear us. I know you raised your hand, but I see actually you have also another. Graham, can you hear us?
I think I've got a mute issue.
Oh,
yes.
We go. Yep, we hear you now. Yep.
Okay, good. First of all, thank you very much to you and to Vlad. I'm the former mayor of Fort Wayne, Indiana, although I'm based now in San Francisco. My experience with federal dollars a number of years ago was that the leveraging or the creative combining of resources that come from the public with private sector resources is very difficult to do. From your reading of, and I'm sure there may be regulations that have to be promulgated, but how can local communities bring together the creative, sort of what I call a collaborative economy of private sector, local, nonprofit, for-profits, community development financial institutions and others to create these new models using the kind of creative technology platforms, the apps, the opportunities to bring people together in a way that leverages both the technology and, as we come out of COVID, the collaborative touch. So I'm thinking about things particularly like community-based solar gardens, where assets can be owned, power can be produced, and the results mean wealth creation for the community, not sending your energy dollars and exporting those energy dollars many miles away to large energy corporations. We're seeing an upspringing in community after community of those kinds, but they complain, the developers, the local community activists, don't find that there are models of this kind of collaborative economy, which leverages multiple capital resources, public and private. How would you suggest that those on the call today and those in communities across the country, large and small, should they be interacting with their city councils, with the community development block grant administrator? How can we get this money flowing in new models, in new ways?
So thank you, Graham, for the great question. We really, really appreciate it. And I think I have a lot of things I'd like to say, but I think the main thing we see is two aspects that I want to say. One is internally within the local governments, like who are the different organizations or departments that would work collaboratively to make this project happen or to make these types of projects happen. And from again, our experience, a lot of times, for example, it's the community development department and working together with the economic development. Sometimes it's there's more of like a digital transformation or an innovation department within the city. And it's often a challenge to get them all in the same room. But I feel like once you can get the right decision makers within the city in the same room and learning from what each one can benefit from these types of initiatives, that's where I think these decisions can be made. And another point that I'll say, and that again, from my experience working with cities for such a long time, is also that a lot of the private sector role, in my mind, is to empower cities, right? We cannot, when we work with city, the messaging coming out, the distribution of, the social media campaigns, which is obviously now critical as people are more remote. Things like even doing a boots on the ground approach. We can't, as a private sector, do it on our own. But I think where our role really comes into play and where we see the biggest impact is by empowering. So teaching the public sector in many ways how to leverage technology and how to give the technology, how the technology can enable them to do much more, in the sense of, for example, how do you get to 200 businesses in 2 days, and how do you, with a boots on the ground approach, by using technology. So different ways to sort of have this collaboration and get much more done. But we as the private sector, I don't think we can do that. So we can help empower the cities and give them the tools to do so. And that's usually where I would say the best connection is the kind of working together, having those weekly discussions, and really knowing that cities don't have the bandwidth right now or the resources to do a lot of these proactive initiatives. So really trying to look at efficiency, looking at kind of minimizing overhead for these things and how to kind of work together to achieve the most. Elad, I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I see that we have more questions. So I do want to say again that we'll post a recording of this webinar on the ELGL website. And this whole webinar is brought to you with a partnership with ELGL. And we're also happy to share this deck and answer more of specific questions. Michael, your email address is right now on the screen, michael@colu.com. So just we're happy to continue the dialogue of this one. I see more questions.
Yeah, I do see one more question. But Graham, does that answer your question or any follow-up question you had?
That's fine, thank you.
Great. And next question comes from Allison Bell. The question is, what do you think about a regional approach in which several cities and counties come together in this, especially for areas that have a lot of smaller units of government? So great question. And I recently presented in the North Carolina Rural Summit, and that question came up a lot. And that's definitely something we've looked at a lot. And we're also working with different counties. And that's especially helpful with smaller municipalities who may not have the financial resources or even resources from a staffing perspective to handle these projects. So a lot of times these type of collaborative approaches are extremely helpful. And then also we've seen like councils of government. So it's sometimes like a cohort of different local governments. The interesting thing is really when you work with different local governments kind of together, it's how do you find that common denominator? Right, with the city, we talk about civic pride, but sure, you can have county pride. But when it comes to council of government, so how do you find, again, from a marketing perspective, that sort of convergence? And that's where we always see kind of on one hand, it's great. On the other hand, it takes some planning, but it's definitely something we see. And it's something that we believe that in the next year, we'll be doing a lot more of, especially in order to get to smaller municipalities and local governments. Any other questions? Okay, I see one from Veronica Creech. What are your thoughts about multiple business alliances, such as chambers, etc., apply together versus the city apply on behalf of small businesses and then engage with the local business alliances? So that's, again, a great question, Veronica. And we definitely, I would say the majority of our work is with municipalities. However, we also are indeed working with chambers. In many cases, you're right. It is first the municipality, and then as kind of once the municipality is funding the program, for example, then the chamber may be the entity that supports the boots on the ground. However, we are seeing some chambers or different groups that are non-government groups directly wanting to support these initiatives. And we definitely see that as an option. It's just really what's the presiding entity for it and how does that entity connect with the local businesses? So it could be a chamber, it could be a downtown association, it could be a business improvement district or a special improvement district, whatever it may be. So definitely, that's definitely a possibility. Right? Any other questions? Okay, so thank you all again for joining. Definitely a wonderful turnout with people from all over. So very excited that so many of you had a chance to join. Once again, we are here to support. Obviously, the ARP Act that has come out will have huge impact on cities and local governments, and we really want to make sure that we can help cities do the most and make the most impact, and really ultimately support small businesses, support shopping local, and really come out of this pandemic strong, and really getting people into new habits and getting people again to think local, have the sense of civic pride. We see this as an opportunity, and we see so much going on. We're learning so much every day. We're constantly adapting. We see technology is a huge part of this, and we're obviously here to help and here to support in any way possible, to make sure that, again, more can get done and more people and businesses can be supported. So again, thank you all for joining, and feel free, if you have any questions later, to ask them by email. And have a great weekend.
And happy Passover.
Happy Passover and Easter for those in the week.
Easter.
All right. Bye, everyone.